He was hours away from death, sitting in a cold prison cell under flickering fluorescent lights, hands trembling, eyes hollow, counting the minutes like a man who had already made peace with the end. The execution was scheduled. The chamber was ready. The world had already decided his story was over. And then he made one final request. Not for food, not for a lawyer, not for mercy. He asked to see his dog, a retired German Shepherd police dog named Ranger. The same animal he had trained from a frightened puppy into one of the most celebrated canine officers in the department's history. Guards laughed quietly among themselves. Officers shook their heads. Nobody understood it. A man about to die, spending his last precious minutes on Earth with a dog? But when Ranger walked through that prison door, nobody was laughing anymore. Because Ranger didn't run to him. Ranger didn't whine or wag or press his gray muzzle into his former partner's hands the way everyone expected. Instead, the old German Shepherd stopped, stiffened, and growled, deep, low, and aimed at something in that room that no human eye could see and no human nose could find. The officers froze. The warden froze. And in the stunned silence that followed, Ranger began to expose a truth that had been buried for years, buried under courtroom documents, under departmental pressure, under the comfortable certainty of a verdict that everyone had accepted and nobody had questioned since the day it was handed down. A truth that the justice system, investigators, and 12 jurors had all failed to find. A truth that had been sitting quietly inside a dog's memory for years, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question in the right room at the right moment. A truth that was about to save an innocent man's life with less than 2 hours to spare. This is a story about what happens when loyalty outlasts everything. The headlines, the handcuffs, and the silence. This is the story of Ranger. His name was Ethan Ward, 12 years on the force. A record full of commendations, successful drug busts, recovered missing children, and a partnership with a German Shepherd that officers across the city talked about like it was something from a movie. Ethan and Ranger were the kind of team that criminals feared and colleagues admired. They moved through their work like two halves of a single instinct. Then one night, everything ended. The official story spread fast. Ethan Ward had shot and killed a fellow officer during a warehouse raid. When backup arrived, he was kneeling beside the body, blood on his hands, his weapon recently fired. No weaknesses. No cameras inside the abandoned building. Ballistics matched his gun perfectly. The media dismantled him in days. Headlines called him a traitor, a killer, a fallen hero who had snapped without warning. His badge was stripped before he had finished a single sentence in his own defense. But the detail that sealed his fate in the public's mind wasn't the evidence. It was Ranger. The dog had been found at the scene, barking frantically at Ethan as officers pulled him away. To every camera and every headline, it looked like a loyal animal accusing the man who had betrayed everything they shared. The prosecution used that image in the courtroom like a weapon. If his own dog turned on him, they said, "What more proof do you need?" Ethan never stopped saying the same 4 words from his arrest to his conviction. "I did not do it." Nobody believed him. The jury took less than 3 hours to decide. Ethan was sentenced to death. He accepted it in silence. Not because he believed it was just, but because Ranger had been taken away the night of his arrest, and without his partner, he had nothing left worth fighting for. He stopped arguing. He simply waited until the date arrived. And then he made the one request everyone thought was pointless. The request had been approved after a full hour of debate between the warden and the prison board. Allowing a retired K-9 into the execution wing broke every standard protocol. But Ranger's service record was extraordinary, and the warden, a man who prided himself on running things by the book, found himself unable to look a condemned man in the eye and refuse him 10 minutes with the only family he had left. Ranger arrived in a black SUV driven by Officer Cole, his current handler. The dog was older now, grayer around the muzzle, joints moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had put years of hard work into every bone in his body. But his eyes were the same, sharp, present, reading every layer of his surroundings with the effortless precision of a dog who had spent a decade being paid to notice things that humans missed. When Cole opened the transport crate, Ranger stepped onto the prison pavement, and the entire yard went quiet. Guards who had been leaning against walls straightened without being told. Even men hardened by years inside those concrete corridors felt something shift in the air around that dog. Cole kept one hand firm on the leash. "Easy, boy. Just a visit." But Ranger wasn't at ease. He was alert in a way that Cole recognized immediately. Not the alertness of an animal anxious about a new environment, but the focused, locked-in attention of a working dog who had already picked up something worth investigating. Something in this building had caught his attention before he had even reached the door, and he was not going to let it go. Cole had spent 2 years learning every signal Ranger used. The relaxed trot of routine work. The locked stillness of a confirmed alert. What Ranger was doing now was something Cole had seen only a handful of times. The posture of a dog who has walked into a room and recognized something tied directly to a specific trauma in his memory. Something from a night long past. Ethan heard the collar jingle in the hallway before the door opened. He had been waiting for that sound for years, replaying it in memory during the worst nights in his cell, holding it like something precious and fragile that might dissolve if he thought about it too carefully. When the door swung open and Ranger stepped across the threshold, Ethan's breath left his body completely. The dog stood there, older, grayer, but unmistakably himself, and for one electric second, the entire room held still. Then Ranger growled, not the confused bark of an animal in an unfamiliar place, not the anxious whine of a dog who didn't understand what was happening. A low, controlled, deliberate growl aimed at something specific in that room. Guards whispered. One said maybe the dog remembered what Ethan had done. Ethan's voice cracked when he spoke. "Ranger, boy, it's me." But Ranger wasn't reacting to Ethan's voice. He circled him slowly, nose working in sharp, rapid pulls of air, body low and precise, moving with the hunter's stance that Ethan had watched him use on hundreds of missions. Cole straightened. "That's not an aggression posture," he said quietly. "That's investigation." Ranger pressed his nose to Ethan's left shoulder, froze completely, then barked once, sharp, sudden, and impossibly urgent. Cole's face changed. He approached Ethan carefully, lifted the back of his prison shirt, and went completely still. "Warden," Cole said, his voice stripped of everything except shock. "That's not a scar. That's a puncture wound. Old. Deep. Exactly where Ranger alerts when someone has been stabbed." The room fell into a silence, so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Cole slowly lifted his eyes from the wound to Ethan's face, then to the warden. "Sir," Cole said quietly, "if Ranger is alerting to this wound, he recognized it from the night of the raid. It means the story everyone believed for the last decade may not be the story that actually happened. The puncture wound unlocked something that years of isolation and grief had buried so deeply Ethan had stopped believing it existed. A memory, fractured, incomplete, arriving in pieces like broken glass catching light, but real. The warehouse, the cold, rain hammering the metal roof. He and Ranger moving through the dark corridors toward the back of the building, following a tip about stolen weapons. Ranger had stopped suddenly, body rigid, ears forward. Something was wrong. Ethan had raised his weapon, and then the darkness exploded. A figure dropped from the rafters and slammed into him so hard his flashlight flew across the room. A second figure kicked Ranger hard into a stack of metal pipes. Pain tore through Ethan's left shoulder, sharp, specific, the unmistakable bite of a blade going deep. Someone grabbed his collar. A voice hissed something close to his ear that he couldn't make out, muffled, distorted, like words spoken through water. Then gunshots, a body falling, Ranger barking with a desperation that Ethan had never heard from him before or since. Then sirens, flashlights, voices shouting, hands grabbing him. And cutting through all of it, one sentence crystalline and cold. Ethan shot him. He shot the officer. Ethan had tried to speak. Someone else was there, but his voice had been swallowed by the chaos. And then everything went dark. He snapped back to the present, breathing hard, sweat cold at his temples. Ranger was watching him, not with the confusion or the growl from minutes ago, with recognition, with something that looked, after all these years of separation, like relief. Someone else was in that warehouse, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ranger saw it, and the dog barked once, sharp and immediate, as if he had been waiting years for someone to finally say those words out loud. Ranger wasn't finished. He turned from Ethan and moved toward the far corner of the room, his growl building steadily, aimed with precise and unmistakable intention at a guard who had been standing quietly against the wall. Officer Hale, a prison guard who had worked the execution wing for years. Steady, unremarkable, trusted. Ranger's nose moved rapidly between Ethan's shoulder wound and the air around Hale, cross-referencing 2 cents with the methodical focus of an animal who had done this 1,000 times and never once been wrong. Cole stepped closer to Hale, his voice measured and cold. You smell like heavy unregistered gun oil, the kind that doesn't come from a standard service range. Hale's face went white. His laugh came out too loud, too fast. That dog is old. He's confused, but his voice shook. Ranger barked so aggressively the metal door rattled behind him. And then a flashback hit Ethan like lightning. One image, a face close to his in the dark warehouse, a blade catching the light, a hissed voice. Stay quiet or the dog dies. Ethan looked up. That voice, he whispered. It was you. Hale's mask shattered completely. Sweat ran in lines down his face. His hand moved toward his belt before Cole stepped between them. Ranger lunged, yanking Cole's arm with the force of an animal that had decided the moment had arrived, planting himself in front of Ethan with his teeth bared and his entire body positioned as a wall. Hale's confession came in fragments. A corrupt, off-the-books operation, an officer who found out and threatened to report it, a decision made in panic, and a decorated K-9 handler who had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment and had paid for it with his entire life. I'm sorry, Hale whispered as the handcuffs went on. Ethan said nothing. Sorry didn't give back 12 years. But the truth had finally found its way into the light. Hale had barely been escorted from the room when Ranger moved again. His body turned, slow and deliberate, toward the line of guards standing along the far wall and locked onto a face that nobody in that room had suspected. Lieutenant Marsh, second in command of the entire prison. The man who had overseen Ethan's incarceration for years, who had sat in on hearings and signed documents and looked Ethan in the eye across tables without flinching once. 2 sharp alert barks. Direct. Final. The warden stepped forward. Lieutenant, is there something you want to tell us? Marsh's jaw tightened. His reaction came fast and defensive and slightly too loud. You're trusting a dog over my record? Cole's reply was quiet. Ranger doesn't alert to records. He alerts to truth. Marsh's hand moved toward his hip. Ethan saw it first and shouted the warning. Correspond. Ranger was already moving, faster than anyone expected from an aging dog, launching himself at Marsh's wrist and knocking the concealed weapon loose before it cleared the holster. It clattered across the concrete floor. Guards tackled Marsh to the ground. And in the ringing silence that followed, Ranger stood over the disgraced lieutenant and stared at him with the unblinking certainty of an animal who had been carrying a witness's memory for years and had finally, in the last possible hour, been allowed to speak it. Marsh confessed everything from the floor, the illegal operation, the officer who had to be silenced, the decision to frame the one person whose fall would generate enough grief and outrage to bury the truth permanently. Ethan Ward, clean record, trusted face, perfect scapegoat. I lost my badge, my life, my years, Ethan said, his voice cracking. And you watched it happen. Marsh looked away. There was nothing left to say. The warden's radio call to the state governor stopped the execution with less than 90 minutes remaining. The chains came off Ethan's wrists and fell to the concrete floor with a sound that nobody in that room would forget. He stood still for a long moment, staring at his own hands as if relearning that they belonged to him. Then he turned to Ranger. The old German shepherd sat proudly in the center of the room, chest forward, ears alert, eyes steady, with the composed dignity of a soldier who had just completed the most important mission of his career. Ethan knelt down and pressed his forehead against the dog's. You never forgot, he whispered. You carried it the whole time. Ranger released a long, quiet breath against Ethan's chest, The sound of years of confusion and separation and faithful waiting finally arriving somewhere they could both rest. When Ethan walked out of that prison the following morning, he walked through the front entrance. Not the back gate, not in chains, through the front door, into pale early sunlight, with Ranger walking beside him and leaning slightly into his leg with every step, the way he always had on the mornings after a long and difficult night. A row of reporters waited behind a barricade, cameras ready. They had come expecting to cover an execution. Instead, they witnessed a man stepping back into a life that had been stolen from him, guided by the one witness who had never been able to testify until now. Ethan stopped at the microphones. Ranger sat at his side. He looked at the cameras and said simply, the truth was never lost. It was waiting in a dog who refused to forget it. And as they walked together toward the waiting car, Ethan reached into an envelope a nurse had pressed into his hands and found a photograph. Him and Ranger. First day as partners. On the back, in his own faded handwriting. Where you go, I go. It had always been a promise. It had turned out to be a prophecy.